Everyone on that plane survived the impact. Every single one of them. Then most of them drowned. Steps from an open door. That is the haunting reality of Pan American Flight 526A. April 11th, 1952. Good Friday. A Douglas DC-4 named the Clipper Endeavor lifted off from San Juan, Puerto Rico, bound for New York, and never made its destination. It struck the water and it floated. It handed those people a genuine chance to live, yet most of them could not take it. For 74 years, nobody knew exactly where it went down. Then a robot found it in the pitch black, 2,000 feet below the surface, and photographed everything. What did it see down there? It should fundamentally change the way you think about every flight you have ever boarded in your life. Because the reason those passengers died is the exact reason you get a safety speech before takeoff today. 69 people climbed aboard that afternoon. They expected a routine hop from the warm islands up to the mainland. Nothing about the day felt dangerous, but life changes in seconds. At just 350 feet off the ground, engine number 3 quit. 350 feet. That is barely higher than a city block, which left the flight crew with a heavy plane, full of passengers and almost no altitude to think. Captain John C. Byrne banked the aircraft around, trying to limp back toward the runway. The Atlantic had other plans. Mid-turn, engine number 4 died too. Suddenly, half the power was gone. The airport still sat miles away, and the water below churned with rough, gray swells. Byrne made the only call left to him. He was going to set it down on the waves, a controlled ditching into the sea, with dozens of lives riding on his hands. And somehow, he pulled it off. Byrne's landing worked. That's when it turned cruel. The DC-4 slammed into the swells about 5 miles off the northern coast of Puerto Rico, and the force of the collision ripped the tail clean off the body of the plane, but the main cabin held together. It stayed in one piece. It floated. 69 people, alive, bobbing on the surface of the Atlantic, with the doors right there in front of them. How do you survive a plunge like that, only to face a worse fate? They lived through the very thing that was supposed to kill them. The dying engines, the terrifying plunge, the impact, all of it. Every soul on board survived the initial impact. And then the clock started ticking. That cabin was not going to stay up forever. Seawater already poured in through the torn-off tail. They had minutes, maybe less. And nobody had ever told them what to do in an emergency. Less than 3 minutes. That is how long the cabin lasted above water before it slipped under. Under 3 minutes to move 69 people out of a floating metal tube. It should have been enough time. It was not even close. Why? Because in 1952, there was no safety briefing. None. Nobody stood at the front and pointed to the exits. Nobody showed a single passenger where the life vests waited. So when the water rushed in, people groped under their seats and found things they did not understand. They could not get the vests on. They did not know where the doors were. Fear finished the job. Passengers froze in place, gripping the armrests as the cold sea climbed up their legs. 52 of them drowned, not from the impact, from panic and silence and a system that assumed you would just figure it out yourself in a crisis. That is it. That is the whole tragedy. If this story is already getting under your skin, subscribe to the channel right now. This is where the disaster's history nearly buried for good get pulled back into the light. We do not look away from the hard truths here. We find out what happened, why it happened, and what it cost. So who kept anyone alive at all? One man, mostly. During those brutal minutes, Captain John Byrne stayed inside the sinking cabin, physically seizing terrified passengers and hurling them out the doors into the sea, dragging bodies that would not move, throwing frozen people toward open air and a chance. Few people know this about Byrne. This was not his first time going into the water. 9 years earlier, in 1943, he had crashed another Pan Am aircraft, the Yankee Clipper. Same pilot, 2 marine disasters, and he still climbed back into a cockpit and still found the nerve, when it counted most, to save lives with his bare hands. 17 people came out of that saltwater alive, 12 passengers and 5 crew members. A lot of them owed their lives to a captain who flat out refused to go down quietly. Byrne was not the only one who became a hero in the water that day. As Coast Guard rescue crews raced to the scene, a co-pilot named Jack Natwig spotted a young boy. In the swells, drowning, getting dragged away by the current. The sea was rough. It was full of sharks. Natwig did not hesitate for a heartbeat. He leapt straight out of a Coast Guard aircraft and into the waves to reach the child. Picture that. A grown man jumps into shark-filled water from an aircraft for a boy he had never met in his life. That is not written in any procedure manual. That is a decision a person makes in half a second with everything on the line. And it worked. The child lived. Acts like that are the only reason. The count of the dead did not climb even higher. But split-second heroics should never be the safety plan. After this event, someone in charge finally agreed. Rescuers reached them fast. This was never one of those aircraft that simply vanished without a trace. Within minutes, boats and planes were dragging survivors out of the Atlantic, 5 miles from land. Everyone knew what had happened and roughly where. The only thing truly lost was the exact resting place of the wreck itself, sunk in water far too deep for anyone in 1952 to reach. So the story did not turn into a decades-long hunt for a missing plane. It became something quieter and sadder than that. 39 bodies were never recovered. 39. They stayed down there, wherever there was. While the world moved on and the details yellowed inside old newspaper files, the survivors went home. The families grieved. And the disaster might have faded out of memory entirely, if not for one thing it left behind. A rule. A rule that would end up protecting you. You think the safety briefing has always been part of flying. The seatbelt demonstration. The pointing at the exits. The life vest tucked under your seat. You assume it was always there, part of the deal. It was not. Before 1952, airlines mostly trusted passengers to handle an emergency on pure instinct. This event blew that idea apart. Later that same year, the Civil Aeronautics Board studied what happened off Puerto Rico. A floating cabin. People who could not locate their vests. Dozens who never got out, and they wrote a hard rule. Every overwater commercial flight now had to deliver a pre-flight safety briefing and show passengers the emergency exits before takeoff. That speech you tune out on every single flight? It was written in the drowning of the Clipper Endeavor. Genius, right? Except it took a horror like this to get there. If this is hitting the way it should, tap the like button. It genuinely helps push a story like this in front of more people who need to hear it. It keeps these historical accounts alive. For decades after, the exact spot stayed a total blank. Then, in 2019, one small thing set the whole search in motion. An aviation historian named Russ Matthews read a tiny newspaper blurb, not a headline, a blurb. It described a passenger's luggage tag from Flight 526A that had washed up on a beach in Florida, a fragment of the disaster. Carried by the currents for decades, and then dropped back onto the sand like a message in a bottle. Most people would read something like that and turn the page. Matthews could not. That single scrap sent him burrowing through old Coast Guard archives, chasing crew statements, weather logs, coordinates. Anything that might hint at where the Clipper Endeavor actually lay. Years of digging. All of it triggered by a luggage tag and one stubborn man who would not let go. And slowly, piece by piece, a map started to take shape. So how do you find a plane the size of a house over 600 meters down in the abyss? Decades after it sank? You send a robot. Matthews' research eventually linked up with two organizations, the Air/Sea Heritage Foundation and a team called Deep Sea Vision. They brought in an autonomous sonar submersible. Its name was Miss Millie, a military-grade, mine-hunting machine, built to sweep the pitch-black floor of the abyss and locate things people were never meant to reach. Deep Sea Vision's chief, Tony Romeo, pressed a vintage Pan Am sticker onto the flank of that drone before it went down. Why would he do that? Because his own father had worked for Pan Am as a mechanic and a pilot. So the machine sent hunting for a lost Pan Am Clipper, carried the airline's own mark, placed there by a son honoring his dad. That is not a coincidence. That is a promise. On June 2nd, 2026, Miss Millie found it. In the deep dark, roughly 610 meters down. Off the coast of Puerto Rico, the drone's sonar caught the outline of something that had no business on the seabed, the Clipper Endeavor. Split into two main sections, exactly the way it broke apart on the surface. All those years ago, the fuselage resting in one place, the severed tail in another. 74 years. That is how long it had waited in the cold and the dark, untouched, while everyone who might have found it either gave up or passed on. And the instant that sonar image sharpened on the screen, an impact that had shrunk to a footnote in dusty files became real again. Physical. Findable. There. But the team did not stop at simply finding it. They wanted to look at it. Every single inch. So they photographed everything. 350,000 high-resolution images. That is how many pictures the drone captured to map the entire wreck. And what those photos revealed stunned the people who had chased this thing for years. The aluminum body of the aircraft still held its shape. Not a rusted heap, not a scattered field of scrap. A preserved fuselage, sitting upright on the seabed like it had settled there gently. And on the side of it, clear enough to read after 74 years soaking in salt water, the Pan Am logo. Still there, still legible. The very same mark Tony Romeo had taped onto his machine stared right back at him from the wreck itself. On July 21st, 2026, the team told the world what they had found. The response came instantly. People did not see metal on a monitor. They saw a grave. And that single fact shaped everything that came next. Plenty of expeditions would have gone wrong at this point. They could have hauled pieces to the surface, recovered artifacts, brought remains up for the cameras and the headlines and the fame. They refused. The team announced they would not disturb the wreckage and would not recover any remains out of respect for the families of the victims. The people who were never brought home back in 1952 are still resting down there, and the searchers decided they would stay exactly where they are. Instead, they began working with the government of Puerto Rico to turn the whole site into an officially protected memorial, a grave marker in the deep. No looting, no souvenirs, no disturbance of any kind. Just recognition, finally, for the people who died steps from safety on a Good Friday afternoon. When was the last time a discovery this big ended with someone choosing to leave it alone? That is rare. That is right. 2 people who lived through that ordeal are still alive today, 74 years later. One of them is a former nurse, now 102 years old, who was pulled out of that water as a young woman and has carried the memory of that afternoon for her entire life. Think about what she witnessed. The frozen passengers, the rising water, the captain throwing bodies out the doors. She survived it, and she lived long enough to hear that the plane had finally been found. That is the whole reason any of this matters. Not the drone, not the sonar, not the hundreds of thousands of pictures. The people, the ones who drowned in silence, because no one warned them, and the ones who received a safety speech born from their tragedy. If any of this reached something in you, like this video and subscribe. The stories the sea keeps hidden deserve to be found and told and remembered.